In many ways, I found this to be a work of, the history of continental philosophy in one sense. And I can't imagine that you necessarily started off thinking that way. And I mention that not to scare people away that, well, I'm not a philosopher. I don't like continental philosophy. But what you've done is a helpful service to the church as an historian to uncover this history of ideas and demonstrate that indeed these ideas do have consequences. And what we're seeing today with this crisis of identity, where we really can't even say whether someone is male or female, because that would be dependent on what they determined themselves. These questions you mentioned that would have been utter nonsense to your grandfather are now very commonplace and the norm on television and in the culture. How did this work morph in that way? I mean, did you ever envision yourself becoming a continental philosopher of sorts?
No, I say on my Grove City College website, somebody pointed out to me yesterday when they asked me about reading habits. And I say, I'm a very undisciplined reader. I just read whatever that interests me, which means I've read a whole lot about a whole lot of stuff, but I've
Yeah.
never really settled in any major area.
Even
So
on the philosophy of wine, that was one of your recommendations to me. So you're into all the philosophies.
I love Roger Scruton and his
Yeah.
book, I Drink, Therefore I Am.
Yeah.
Not for Baptists, but for Presbyterians, I think is a wonderful, wonderful book. Now, the structure actually took me it was as hard to work out the structure as anything, because this
Really.
story, in some ways, it's like an octopus. I had, during my year in Princeton, I had dinner with an old friend, Gordon Graham, who we were colleagues at Aberdeen many years ago, and he was latterly professor of philosophy at Princeton Seminary. And we had dinner, and I was outlining the project to him, and his comment to me was, it's going to be impossible to pull that together. That's an octopus. And so I really struggled with the structure. And I'm very grateful to Grove, to the Institute of Faith and Freedom at Grove, for providing me with a research assistant, a final year student at whom I was able to throw my stuff and ask her, does it make sense? How do I fit this together? So the structure was hard, but it was a team effort. Myself and Kirsten, my research assistant,
Yeah.
sort of worked on that. Um, yeah, my bottom line was I wanted that sentence, I'm a woman trapped in a man's body.
Mm-hmm.
What do I have to use sort of language that I know you would love, Camden? What do I have to presuppose as true in order for that to be,
Amen,
to make sense? What does the culture have to imagine about reality?
right.
For that sentence to be plausible? My grandfather would regard it as nonsense. And I identified a number of things as I reflected on that. Well, you've got to separate your identity from your embodiment, really.
Mm-hmm.
You've got to psychologize your identity. You've got to separate biological sex from gender. There are all kinds of things that have got to come into play. You have to understand the purpose of your life as something that you determine. It's not something that is placed upon you from outside. And it was with those things in mind, I said, okay, well, I've really got to trace, how does identity get psychologized? How does psychology get sexualized?
Mm-hmm.
And how does sex get politicized? And that was the
Absolutely.
kind of the three phases of the history that I saw. With Rousseau and the Romantics, you get the psychologizing of identity. With Freud, you get the sexualizing of psychology. And then in the 20th century, you get the politicizing of sex. That was the kind of the main spine of the narrative. There are other narratives as well. I got into a little bit of trouble with this with the students actually at Grove, when I regard Hugh Hefner as rather key to the narrative, because he, of all people, he's the guy who popularizes pornography.
Mm-hmm.
He's the guy who popularizes the idea that human satisfaction is found sexually. He's a popularizer of Freud in many ways. And more people will have looked at Playboy than have read Freud.
Sure.
I did refer to Hefner as a genius in class, and that was taken as a point of approbation. I didn't mean he was a great guy. I meant that he was very clever in how he marketed this stuff.
Yeah, and his thought and ideas were seminal for others.
Yeah,
And that's in
yeah.
that sense of genius, I suppose.
Because you always have to, there's always that story of how do these ideas that intellectuals think,
Mm-hmm.
how do they become the common currency of how ordinary people intuit the world around them. And it's often a complicated story.